you and everyone else for being invited to this wonderful opportunity to talk about migration research. Uh, Migration research is not my job or my work, it's my life. And so I always enjoy talking to people about migration. And let me just say, sometimes people ask me, where are you from? Guatemala or no, I'm from Corpus Christi. I was born and raised in Corpus. And actually, my family has a long history here. Three of my four grandparents were born in Texas. And only one was born in Mexico, actually in Matamoros, which is across the street from Brownsville. So pretty much a Texan here, but I'm extremely interested in migration, understanding why workers move, why women seek other countries to live in, understanding how migration is organized and the challenges and dangers of migration. So with that said, let me move on to the next slide. And this, by the way, is the cover of a book I published, co-authored a few years ago on Guatemalan migration to the U.S. Let me also say that a lot of what I learned about migration from Mexico, Central America, South America, and even Asia, I learned while I was a professor at the University of Houston. So my research is a strong Houston bias, and I'm happy to say that. Okay, so yeah, I want to talk about Central American migration, specifically Honduran, Salvadoran, and Guatemalan, and mainly Guatemalan migration, because since 1985, I have been studying a community in Guatemala that sends many of its migrants to Houston. And so since 1985, when I first made contact with these migrants from Guatemala. Now, keep in mind, Guatemala has two populations. One is indigenous Mayan people, and you see Mayan women here, traditional cultural people. But about half of Guatemala's 18 million population is not Mayan, and it consists of people who are mestizos, or we would call them mixed race, or people that look like me, who don't have traditional Mayan culture background. And so the migration from Guatemala to the U.S. to Houston is also divided by the indigenous migrants who are coming from communities such as this and the non-indigenous migrants, right? And so I've been tracking this migration again since 1985. And in 1988, I took my first trip to Guatemala, to these communities where the migrants come from, high up in the Western Highlands. And so I went every year for like 10 years. And then I stopped and I started going to another country, China, for several years. And I stopped. And then I started going to Guatemala again. And I was last there in December. Uh, I want to mix some graphs here, just to show you that the migration is both of people who come with a visa. This is Guatemalan immigration into the U.S. The blue line is people who come with a visa, and the orange line are people who come without a visa and are apprehended at the border. Okay, and the reason I'm showing you this, because I want to show you that whenever you have legal migration, you also have illegal or unauthorized migration. And you can see there's almost like the lines are almost like coincide in terms of slopes and things like that, right? So you're like, sometimes the blue line are people who come with a visa, let's say a husband or something, to work, but then doesn't bring the wife because for some reason they couldn't get a visa for her. And so the wife will come without a visa, undocumented, right? Or vice versa. Sometimes the wife will come with a visa and then the husband comes as undocumented. Or the parents come and then the children come unaccompanied by adults. So the point that I'm trying to make here is when you have legal migration, you're likely to have migration from the same country of people without visas, illegal, undocumented, whatever you want to call it, right? And I call those parallel patterns of migration. And we could talk a lot about those later. And so in looking at Central American migration, when I say Central American, I'm thinking mainly of Hondurans, Salvadorians, and Guatemalans, the northern part of Central America, where we get most of the Central American migrants. I looked at Guatemalan migration in the book that I showed you at the beginning, and I divided based on the rise and fall of immigration numbers, Guatemalan migration into 7 phases, say 7 stages starting in 1970. And I call that the prelude, when 13,000, a small number of Guatemalans were admitted legally into the US as immigrants. And then war broke out in Guatemala between the late 70s, mid 80s, and the migration increased. More migrants from Guatemala were accepted, but then many people came because of the war and because of economic decline associated with the war. The US government apprehended like 42,000 Guatemalans at the US border, right? So this is like the initiation of the flow of Guatemalans, illegal and unauthorized, legal and illegal. And then we see a phase 2, which is the late 1980s. And we see that a smaller number of Guatemalans are admitted, 16,610. And, you got almost 26,000 Guatemalans were apprehended at the border between 86 and 88. And this is an important phase, stage of because in this phase, the U.S. government passed something called the Immigration Reform and Control Act that gave amnesty to immigrants who had been here without visas for more than 5 years and who had been working or trying to find work and did not get in trouble with the police. And so that's an important phase because something like 50,000 Guatemalans applied and got amnesty because they were here without visas. And the reason that's important is because once you get legal status, you can then sponsor family members who are still back home, right? So it creates a pipeline. And phase 3, you had late 80s, early 90s, amnesty. And with amnesty, people could get a green card and they could travel back home. If you're undocumented, if you're here illegally, you can't travel back home because you won't be able to come back to your family in the US or your job. But once you get a green card, you can go back and forth, and that promoted relations we call transnational development between immigrant communities in the US and immigrant communities back in Guatemala, Honduras, or El Salvador. And phase 4 and 5 are just expansions, more settlement of Central Americans and Guatemalans. And then you see the migration going into what we used to call the deep South, Georgia and Arkansas and Alabama. So now migration of Guatemalans, Central Americans, Mexicans spreads into the deep South. And by phase 4, we're now in the 21st century. You have stability and binational development as people have been in the US from Central America and Guatemala for a couple of decades. They've been working, sending money back home. So there's now development back home in Guatemala and to some extent Honduras and El Salvador, right? And then more recently, you have a rise of migration of people coming and the numbers who were apprehended. Here we have Guatemalans apprehended or almost 300,000 at the border, right? So that's a new phase. The waves are much larger, and I'm actually working on a book idea to try to understand that. Why did the migration change so dramatically? The early migration in the 1980s was very much affected by civil war in Guatemala. violence associated with civil war, and especially the Maya were very hard hit by the Guatemalan government, view the Maya as potential supporters of the guerrilla movement. So by the Guatemalan army's own admission, they destroyed over 400 Mayan villages in the highlands. And so the Maya had to flee for survival, and many fled to southern Mexico, Chiapas, and the UN came in and set up refugee camps for the Maya from Guatemala. But many Guatemalans also fled to Houston, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, all over the US, right? As they're fleeing war. But anytime you have war, you have economic instability. The only people who make money during war are the people who sell guns and things like that. So because of economic instability, poverty became stronger, rose, and so people left. If they weren't living in violent zones because of the war, they were living in zones that were economically bad off. So people migrated to look for work in the US to make money. And in Houston, we had people from different communities in Guatemala, from the departments of Totonicapan, Santa Cruz del Quiché, Quetzaltenango. And I met these people in Houston in the 80s and 90s. And you should know that the Mayan population, which is about half of the Guatemalan population, is divided to like 22 linguistic groups. These groups have their own languages within Guatemala. And so these are the indigenous languages that are used today in Guatemala, but also in places where Mayans settled in the US, like in Houston. There are different Mayan languages that are spoken in Houston. When I was there, I heard people use the language Quiché or Ichil or Cachiquel, Nan, Pocomam. So all these indigenous languages now exist in Houston, in LA, in Chicago, and places where the indigenous people settle. And here, this slide is just looking at President Reagan in I think, November of 1986, signing the amnesty law called the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which gave amnesty something like 2.5 million undocumented workers and families. And this included something almost 50,000 Guatemalans. So we were able to go through, right? This amnesty law had a carrot and a stick. The carrot was amnesty. If you're here illegally and you've been here for 5 years and you've been working or looking for work and you didn't get in trouble with the police, then you qualified to apply for amnesty. That was the carrot. The stick was that for the first time, it became against the law to hire undocumented workers. And so employers could no longer hire undocumented workers. They could, but they would be penalized. They would be fined or arrested. So that was the stick. And the idea was to try to control undocumented immigration by closing down the US labor market. And so the law was enacted, but it was successful in legalizing immigrants, but it wasn't successful in stopping undocumented immigration, which continues to today, okay? There's a book on the implementation of this amnesty law in Houston, a case study done in 1994 by Dr. Jacqueline Hagan, a sociologist. The title of her book is Deciding to Be Legal, and it's the story of how Guatemalans went through amnesty applications in Houston in the late 1980s. There were, as I said earlier, a great benefit of becoming legalized, of getting amnesty for all migrants, including the Guatemalans, is that now you could travel back home and visit your family, because undocumented workers could not leave the U.S. because it would be very hard to get back in. You have to pay a smuggler. You're probably going to get arrested at the border, etc. Many people, once they're inside the U.S., many undocumented, don't go back. They stay here. They don't see their families. And so we're looking at the 80s and early 90s before we had, Zoom and Skype and all of that. And so people now with amnesty could go back. And here you have a picture of a truck, a pickup truck. And these are couriers. These are like informal UPS or Federal Express. And these are Guatemalans and other Central Americans and Mexicans who come to like Houston and other cities, and they visit immigrant families from those countries, and they ask them if there's anything they want to send back to their home country, to their families. It's like UPS or Federal Express. And for a fee, these guys will take your packages back to your family, and they come once a month from the different countries, and there are many of these informal couriers. So that's the reason that truck is there. It's a way that migrants maintain transnational relations with their families back home. On your left, you see a Mayan woman. She's actually an immigrant in Houston, but she's now back home, and she's taken a video recording of festivals in her village, so that when she came back to Houston, she can share those with the families from Guatemala who can't go back because they don't have legal status. Of course, now this is all changed. Now we have, Zoom, we have WhatsApp, we have all kinds of, even in the most remote villages in Guatemala, you'll find people with iPhones and things like that. So communication now is much, much improved. Ways that these transnational relations are built. Here's a bus line that went. This is an incredible bus line. It ran from like Honduras and El Salvador through Guatemala all the way through Mexico into Houston. And so you could, if you had the visas, you could use this bus to come into Houston. I don't think it exists anymore, but for a while there in the 1990s, it was running, right? And a way to, if you can't fly in, you're not going to, get the bus, right? And it would take, I think, a couple of weeks to get here because it'd go to many towns. On your right, you see here, this is an advertisement for a courier agency or company. These are families who open up businesses to do package delivery. So if you're in Guatemala and you want to send family member in Oklahoma a package, these guys would take it to all those places. And so you can see where the migration from this town up in the Western Highlands of Guatemala has gone to. So this town has sent migrants to Oklahoma, Atlanta, Miami, Virginia, Houston, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Los Angeles, right? So this sign tells us about the spread of migration, much of it undocumented, right? From the highlands of Guatemala into areas of the United States. Okay, so this graph, I actually updated this graph this morning, shows you a consequence of the migration from Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, into the U.S. and the money sent back by migrants. Very, very important, a goal of many of the migrants who come in. It's not just to come here and get a job and enjoy the U.S. It's to come here, get a job, make money, and send money home to support your family behind, your elderly parents, your children that you left behind. So you're here working to support them. And you can see that this what we call remittances, sending money back, has really increased and is playing an important role in keeping communities afloat. And so I've traveled to these communities, and people who receive remittances have more money to send their children to school, to buy food, to buy meat for protein. There are many poor families who don't eat meat, not because they're vegetarians or because they don't like it, just they can't afford it. But with money coming in, you can do that. And you can take your grandparents or your parents to the hospital and pay for it. So remittances, we don't hear about these in the news, but it's a major effect of migration, how to keep family afloat back home by sending money to them. So now it's reaching into the billions for those countries. And this are money sent by migrant families and migrants in the US from Houston and Dallas and everywhere. So here's a community that I've been studying since 1988. I've traveled to this community. It's a Mayan community up in the Western Highlands in a department. In Central America, they use the word department for province. Okay, they don't use province, they say department. So the name of the town is San Cristobal, which is Saint Christopher. And then the name of the province is Totonicapán. So it's San Cristobal, Totonicapán. And so the picture the photo on your left is a photo I took in 1988. Okay. And so here the migration had already started, but the money being sent back home was not making a big visible impact yet. Money was arriving, people were buying food, things like that, right? But fast forward like to the year 20, I think the picture on your right, I took probably in the year 2019 or something like that. And it's the same picture, but you can see that something is dramatically different. And that is housing construction has changed dramatically. On your left side picture, the houses are made of adobe, okay? And some of them are falling down, the roofs are in disrepair, etc. But on the right-hand side of the screen, now the houses have been rebuilt with cinder blocks using money that comes in from Houston. Many of these migrants go to Houston or other cities in the US, right, from migrant workers. So one of the benefits of migration, and keep in mind that at least half of this or more of the migration is undocumented, unauthorized, right? The money is being used to rebuild homes. So that's an important effect of migration, is to send money back for family to have new homes that are not falling down, homes with cinder blocks. And so the picture on your left here shows construction of homes before migration and construction of homes after migration, okay? So the before is the building there was yellow and blue, and it's made out of adobe bricks, right? But across the street is a home, a building constructed after migration started, and now it's built with cinder blocks. I need to have a discussion with an architect or an engineer who will tell me which house is more environmentally sound, right? Way in the middle of the picture on the left side, you see a volcano. And I wonder, when that volcano starts shaking, which house will stand better, the adobe or the cinder block? I really don't know, okay? But that's the effect of migration. Then the picture on your right is some families are doing very well. They have 2 or 3 members in the US working and sending back money. And so they've accumulated some savings and they want to invest. And so one of the things some migrant families invest on is like real estate, building houses or to sell, to live in there or to sell. And so here you have a house that maybe was obviously was built in a wrong place because you had a landslide, a mudslide that came down and just destroyed that, right? So people invest, but with all investments, there is risk, okay? And here's a picture on your left, are 3 men who migrated to Houston to work at a supermarket in Houston. And in fact, that supermarket became a big employer for many of the young migrants from San Cristobal, Totonicapán. And so they worked in the supermarket. And so the guy wearing the green shirt is the first migrant from the town to Houston. And then he wrote to his friends and relatives, and they migrated too. And he arrived like in 1980, but by 1982, 83, Many others had migrated from his town into Houston and worked at the supermarket. And the guy on your right wearing the white shirt, he learned to become a baker in Houston, working for the supermarket. The supermarket was Randall's, okay? And then the guy in the middle also worked at Randall's, but he saved enough money, went back to Guatemala to start a construction company. And so the guy in the middle created this oven for the guy in the white shirt to start a bakery. And the reason I bring this story up is because, after I took that picture, I went back and the guy in the white shirt is Miguel. Miguel had not started baking. And I went back another year, he still hadn't turned the oven on. And so I asked Miguel, when are you going to start your bakery? You got this big oven here. And Miguel told me, look, there are 3 bakers in the town. If I start this large oven, I'm going to displace one of them out of business. He says, I can't do that. How is he going to feed his family if I destroy his livelihood? So Miguel said, I have to wait till one of the bakers retires or dies before I can go into business. So the beauty of this, I thought, is he learned the capitalist value of enterprise, right? He wants to start a business, but he didn't learn the capitalist value of competition. He would not compete. It was against the community culture, right? And on the photo on your left shows some other investments that the Guatemalan migrants do. Is they come to the U.S., they buy school buses, they take them back up to Guatemala, and then they prepare them and they use them in the highlands. Many people are poor in the highlands. Poverty rate is 60%, 70%. They can't afford cars, so they have to use buses, right? And so these buses are money-making industry, private industry for profit. And many people like to buy buses to start a bus business. Money for sent back for Guatemala can also be used to buy fuel. Now, the woman on your right is carrying firewood. Firewood's very important in Mayan community. You have wood burning stoves. But some families that have migrants in the U.S., and the migrants are sending back money to the mother. Some of these families can afford to buy propane stoves, and then they use propane gas so the mom doesn't have to get up early in the morning and go get firewood. And so children who are migrants in Houston worry that their mothers are working too hard, and they send them money to buy a propane stove, right? And the money to buy the propane gas, so that migration, in maybe it's a small way, but it's a significant way to help women do less work or heavy work, like carrying firewood. Oh, and this is a slide just to show you. I didn't take this. A friend of mine took this slide, and to show you that some migrants go back with a lot of affection for the United States, right? And they have identity with the United States after being here for years. And so they built a house, they want to paint it like, well, this one, the colors of the US flag, right? To show his gratitude for the United States for all he accomplished here. There's, as I said, maybe half or more of the Guatemalan migrants in the US are undocumented. And so they're one of the main groups that get deported in large numbers. And here I have a graph that runs from the 90s to more recent times. And you can see that tens of thousands of Guatemalans are deported back to Guatemala, especially after 1996, when a new law was passed in 1996 to make it easier to deport people. The law created more reasons for deportation, and so more migrants are cut up and sent back. So it's not all like, hey, they all came and they got jobs, they send money home. No. Many come, but are arrested for being illegally in the country, or for committing a crime, and then they're deported back to Guatemala. You have an order of deportation. It's a serious order, and you can't come back. You cannot come back for 5, 10 years or permanently, depending on why you were deported. And if you do come back and they catch you at the border, then you can be sent to prison for illegal reentry after deportation. So it's a risk that migrants make, right, when they migrate. And I just wanted to show you something. This is not my graph. I got it from the Pew Research Center. But I wanted to point out the year 2014 was the year that for the first time, more non-Mexicans were apprehended at the border for illegal entry than Mexicans. Mexicans were always the largest group to be apprehended at the border for trying to cross without a visa. But in the year 2014, that for the first time, more Central Americans and others, small groups of others, were arrested at the border for illegally crossing the border than were Mexicans. So now the border drama includes other groups, and we hear about this every day on the news, right? I have a small graph on the left side of this slide, and it shows how the number of Mexicans arrested at the border for crossing without a visa has dropped dramatically. And Mexican migration, which defined border policy dynamics, has changed dramatically. And in the year like 2005 to 2011, whatever, more Mexicans went back to Mexico than came from Mexico to the United States. So that Mexican migration has changed dramatically when you got more Mexicans going back than are coming in for a period of time, right? And now it's other groups that are appearing sometimes in larger numbers at the border than Mexicans. And that includes the coming of children, unaccompanied Central American and Mexican children. And I have a graph here. The blue graph are the Central American children, younger than 18, and the orange graph are the Mexican children. And you can see that they have come in thousands, right? And many of the children ride on top of cargo trains to come to northern Mexico. They start down in southern Mexico and ride very dangerous journeys on top of trains, cargo trains, to try to reach the northern border of Mexico to cross into the US. More families started to come as well, family units, it's your moms and their children or dads and children, right? So family units has risen. And I have a graph here where I don't know what happened in 2019, but that's a year that many years of caravans headed towards the border of many family and children, right? And by far, the Guatemalans and the Hondurans were the largest number. And so right now the border is closed. We have Title 42, a public health measure. And so that allows the US government to say, nobody can come in. And you have to remain in Mexico if you want to wait, whatever. But President Biden's administration will remove Title 42 here in May, and we're going to see what happens, with some of this family units coming into the US, right? This is a different when you have single adults coming into work and send money, that's one type of migration. But when you have a family unit, that's a different type, and I think it indicates that support systems in those countries are just not working for families, and we need to learn more about this. This is just a table. I'm just going to read you perhaps the most important variable here is the one in red. It's called infant mortality rate. How many infants die in the first year of birth per 1,000 live births? And the infant mortality rate is a good indicator of poverty and bad nutrition and bad housing conditions. It's a good index to compare bad socioeconomic conditions in a country, the infant mortality rate. And you can see in the US, the infant mortality rate is about 5.4, but in El Salvador, it's over twice that much, and in Guatemala, it's almost 4 times that much. And if you look at just the Maya in Guatemala, that 19 is going to increase to 30 something, right? So these are the conditions that are driving people to seek a survival by migration. And then I have here the proportion of the population that's younger than 15 years of age. And this is important because these are children that are going to grow up and they're going to need jobs when they grow up. And if the jobs are not there, they're going to migrate to look for jobs elsewhere. John, I don't know if I'm coming close to my limit of time. Please let me know.
You've got about 5 minutes or so.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I may finish, yeah. And here's I'm just comparing it with a little bit of dated data here, but an economic comparison of GNI per capita, and just you can see that the U.S. is like at $60,000, but if look at El Salvador, look at Guatemala, Honduras, even Mexico, right? And so there are huge economic comparisons. And you may think, yeah, but these are countries where the prices are low, and that's not true. Okay, people pay the same that we pay or more per gallon of gasoline in those countries. Meat is expensive in those countries, right? So it's not like they have cheaper economies, right? Maybe beans and rice or corn they can afford, but beef is gasoline are costly for them. And so they're in economic dire straits. We mentioned violence. It's also something that affects migration. In some of those countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, even Mexico has a higher violent homicide per 100,000 population. So it's not only trying to survive with poverty for many, not all, but for many people in Central America, but trying to survive with violence around you. And we can talk about that. And demographers use population pyramids to compare population profiles. And all I wanted to show you here was looking at the population pyramid of Guatemala, which is the blue is the male, the red is the female, and by age cohort. And what that shows that Guatemala has a large proportion of its population in the younger ages. So that creates a dependency ratio that's high in Guatemala. And then those children at the bottom are going to grow up and be looking for jobs. And if they're not there, they're going to migrate. And by comparison, you can see the US population pyramid, which is an older population. Our dependency ratio is smaller. Okay, so people are able to spend on other things than just raising children. And here we have a picture of the Pan American Highway up in the Guatemalan Western Highlands. And these are migrants getting ready to get on a bus to come to the US. Some of them have visas, they'll come legally, and others don't have visas. They're going to try to cross into Mexico and survive Mexico and then making it all the way into the US. And one of the things that I wanted to illustrate with this slide is that we live in a capitalist system in the whole world. We call it the capitalist world economy. And sectors are interrelated. Usually the most advanced areas of the capitalist world economy are industrious, prosperous, etc. But they have invariably depended on migrant labor to some extent from areas in countries that are less developed, like Guatemala. So I just finished another book published 2 months ago, looking at the history of capitalist development across the world and the role of migration as a resource for capitalist development. For example, about half of our agricultural workforce in the United States are immigrant workers. Many are undocumented, right? So capitalism has always had an intimate relationship with migration, and legal migration and undocumented migration. So as long as we remain a rich, prosperous country, we're going to have migrants trying to come and become part of the system here. And so capitalism is related to migration, and migration today is related to capitalism. And this is my last slide, and just to show that it's not all just a happy ride that migrants are successful. There's a large price that migrants pay, and that is many die. Every year, part of my research involves looking at estimates of how many migrants die every year trying to cross the border illegally. And since the 1990s, that number has ranged in the hundreds, 200, 300, 400. And last year, we hit a high of over 700 migrants died at the US-Mexico border trying to cross illegally. How do they die? Some drown in the Rio Grande. Some die in the deserts of Arizona or in Brooks County, South Texas. And some, looking at the picture on your left, are killed by Mexican cartels who kidnap them and force them to call home to ask for money to be released. Many of these migrants have poor families. They call home, but they don't have money to pay for a ransom. So they're killed by the cartels in Mexico. And I think that's it. I'm very, I look forward to any questions you may have.
Okay, go ahead and stop sharing, Dr. Rodriguez. And
okay, how do I stop sharing?
it should.
I got it.
Yep, there you go.
Great.
All right. So those of you in the audience, you can type your questions at the chat at the bottom of the screen, or you can quote unquote raise your hand and ask Dr. Rodriguez a question. I'll start with the first one, and then that'll give some people time to type up. We've already got a couple of questions in the chat, but what effect did the North American Free Trade Agreement have on Mexican migration? Is that one of the reasons that it actually has gone down, do you think?
Good question. Good question. One of the effects there were several different effects, right? I mean, it created jobs and Mexicans were able to get more jobs, right?
Right.
But it also, especially in the agricultural sector, NAFTA required Mexico to open up its communal farming land.
Mm-hmm.
Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution protected peasants by saying that they had access to communal lands, which were not going to be sold or rented to anyone else, but to be used by peasant families. But NAFTA required Mexico to change that law and say the peasants can do whatever they want with communal land. They can rent it, they can sell it, you know. And so what happened was that you got big agribusiness companies like Del Monte going into Mexico, right? And they're industrializing agricultural work, from peasant work to big commercial farming. And so that displaced the Mexican peasants, and many of whom, some of whom migrated to the US to look for work here. Okay. So to the extent that NAFTA introduced more efficient technological production in Mexico, it displaced workers in Mexico, some of whom then migrated to the US to look for work here.
Why do you think it's gone down recently, though, so much?
That's a good question, and I'm part of a project that we did research in this question. We sent our graduate students to Central America and Mexico to go do surveys and talk to return migrants. We actually have a book that came out of this, and the answers that we got were just all over the place. Some people said, I went down because enforcement is a lot stronger in the US. I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of using a fictitious name. So, you know, I'm back in Mexico. I have to work 2 or 3 jobs now, but I don't have to hide anymore.
Yeah.
So that was a reason. Others went back just because they said, well, you know, my father passed away, so now I have to be the elder of the family. So it's like a set of different reasons of why people went back.
Okay. You know? Well, let's start with some student questions. One question is from asks, and his question or her question, what aspect of migration do you find most interesting?
That's a very good question. And I find all of it interesting. Maybe I find policies to control migration interesting because I like to see how does the state respond to a historical phenomenon of people traveling long distance to work, survive, whatever. So I'm very interested in policies, I guess, that to contain migrants, you know.
Okay. The next question is from a student of mine, Pete, and Pete wants to know how have the Central American governments reacted to these increasing migrations?
The reactions of the Central American governments has been like heavily related to U.S. reactions. The U.S. is constantly creating new policies that include actions of Central American governments, like U.S. enforcement agents go down to Guatemala and they use Guatemalan police to try to break up smuggling rings. So that the reactions of the Central American government has been mainly in conjunction with what the U.S. seeks to do down there. The U.S. is very present down there in Central America.
Okay, this is related to that. I think the next question is from Steve, a colleague of mine. And he says, in 1954, the CIA overthrew a Guatemalan president named Jacobo Arbenz. Can you explain briefly why this happened and whether it is still affecting migration from that country today?
Yeah. Why that happened was because the president that was in power was supporting workers' movements in Guatemala. And the U.S. didn't like that because there were U.S. interest, agricultural interests, banana companies, huge, that would cross from one Guatemala to Honduras, called United Fruit. And actually, one of the major owners of United Fruit was Secretary of State of the United States. And so the U.S. organized opposition to the Guatemalan government so that they would not support worker movements and unionization of farm workers, right? And so the U.S. opposition to the Guatemalan government was to overthrow the government. And this is no secret. There are many books now written, including by former CIA agents, about what happened, right? And does this affect migration from that country today? I think it does in this way. I'm not going to say this particular event started migration, but these types of movements to squash and destroy worker movements that are trying to improve their lives and their work conditions, right, leads to the maintenance of poor working conditions that continue to propel migrants out of their country to look for better conditions elsewhere. Yeah.
All right. This next question is from Judith, and she may have missed the early part of the presentation, but I'm going to go ahead and read the question.
Sure.
She said, what country is your family from? I'm curious. I am from Zacatecas, Mexico, and I once was an illegal immigrant in the United States. And this subject touches me personally because I remember crossing the Rio Grande with my mom.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for that question. The country I'm from is the United States. I was born in Texas. 3 of my 4 grandparents were born in Texas. My fourth grandparent, my father's father, was born in Matamoros, but he crossed over in the 1800s, even before there was a bridge between Matamoros and Brownsville. And I actually have a copy that he made by hand of the visa they used to. There were no visas, you just crossed over, but they gave him a permit to enter Brownsville. And so I'm born here, but my family was born here. But at some point, somebody came from what's now Mexico into Texas, became Texas.
All right. The next question is from Jessica. This is interesting. She said, my dad is from Belize and immigrated in the early 1980s. Have you ever done any research in Belize, or what research could you point to that has been done?
Yeah, I haven't done any research in Belize. I'm fascinated by Belize. I have friends who travel there who actually who've done research in Belize. I can't remember right now the name of the researchers or their book, but it's something I can look up and would be happy to share this information. But no, Belize is very important, and I did meet some Belizean immigrants in Houston, the Garifuna. The Garifuna are Black Caribs who, in 1793, were displaced by British from the Sugar Islands and dropped off the coast of Honduras and what became Belize. And so they're Black people who speak Spanish and their language of Garifuna. And they have come into the U.S. with other Central Americans and live in significant numbers in U.S. cities, including Houston.
Jessica just typed in the chat, Dr. Rodriguez, she says she has Garifuna in her family.
Yeah, beautiful culture, amazing. And they bring vitality to Houston. And I've had friends who are Garifuna and students. We had a student here who was Garifuna at the University of Texas at Austin Sociology Demography program. He graduated from here, and now this young man is a professor at Princeton University in the sociology department.
Wow.
Garifuna
if you send me the name of the Belize research, Jessica, there's my email address and you can contact me. But if you could send that to me, Dr. Rodriguez, then I'll share it with her.
I will.
That would be great. Jessica, I hope that would work for you, but you contact me and I'll get you the information. All right. That's, I think, about all the time we have. And we appreciate you taking the time to do this, Dr. Rodriguez. And at this stage, everyone, thank you for attending and have a good day. Have a good Friday.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more content from LSC-Kingwood.